These documents were never meant to be shown to the world, not because anyone doubted them, and not because they were unreliable. They could not be made public because the knowledge they contained was considered dangerous, too dangerous to become part of open history. From this point, the story begins. The story of archives that the victors preferred to hide. After the end of the Second World War, a simple and convenient belief took hold in the world. The war was over. Evil had been defeated, the crimes were exposed, and the guilty were punished. History seemed finished and fixed. Everything most terrible was supposedly shown to the world at the tribunals, documented in archives, and condemned forever. It was believed that the Nazi secrets were either destroyed or became public property. The documents were studied, the experiments were analyzed, the conclusions were drawn. This was the official version of the post-war order, and millions of people gladly believed it, wanting to put a final point and never return to that nightmare again. But there was another rule that was not discussed publicly. Some materials could not be revealed, not out of humanity and not out of a desire to forget the past. The reason was far more troubling. The consequences of their publication could be more dangerous than the crimes they described. After the surrender of Germany, the Allies gained access not only to military factories, headquarters, and technologies. They came into possession of the archives. Thousands of folders, laboratory reports, research programs, materials that were never intended for the general public and did not fit into the usual understanding of the war. These were not just documents about cruelty and violence. They were systematic studies, attempts to understand the limits of the human psyche and reactions to fear, pain, and isolation. Experiments in which a person was viewed not as a soldier or a citizen, but as an object of influence and control. At first, it was assumed that these materials would become another proof of the crimes of the Nazi regime. They were planned as exposure and as a warning to future generations, but the deeper the Allies went into the archives, the clearer it became that the problem went beyond morality and condemnation. Some documents did not simply record the horrors of war. They described methods, principles, and approaches that could be reproduced. This knowledge did not depend on ideology or on flags. It could work in any hands and at any time. Then a question appeared that was never brought to public discussion. The problem was what should be done with information that was too dangerous to forget and too dangerous to reveal. At that moment, the familiar picture of the war cracked, and the victors faced not only the legacy of the defeated enemy, but also their own choice. To destroy these archives meant to lose the knowledge forever. To publish them meant to release them into the world and accept the consequences. A third decision was made: to close them, to classify them, to hide them. Thus there appeared documents that could not be shown to the world, not because they were Nazi. They were too effective. From that moment, the Second World War formally ended, but its most dangerous ideas continued to exist in the silence of the archives. When the Allied armies entered the territory of Germany, their interest quickly went beyond military trophies and destroyed infrastructure. In addition to factories, headquarters, and weapons depots, scientific institutions, research centers, and archives immediately drew attention. The Nazi regime guarded them as carefully as military sites. There was hidden something that would later become a source of serious doubt and concern. At the disposal of the Allies appeared not separate documents, but entire systems of knowledge. Reports of medical institutes, programs of the SS, research carried out under the cover of science and state security. Many of these materials had no direct relation to the front. They were devoted to the human being, to perception, to reaction to stress, to fear, to pain, to isolation, and to submission. It was an attempt to turn psychology and physiology into instruments of war. What was especially alarming was that these studies had a systemic nature. They were not chaotic experiments of fanatics. They were long-term programs with funding, with methods, and with reporting. The human being was viewed as a resource that could be studied, broken, rebuilt, and used. In these archives, the war went beyond weapons and technology and moved into the field of influence on consciousness. For the Allies, this became an unexpected discovery. Until then, Nazi crimes were associated mainly with mass violence, with camps, and with destruction. But now it became clear that another war was being waged in parallel. Quiet, laboratory, directed not at destroying the enemy, but at controlling the enemy, at finding ways to suppress will and change behavior without direct use of force. Many of the materials that were found contradicted the usual ideas about acceptable limits of science. They showed how far a state can go when it stops seeing a person as an individual. But something else was even more disturbing. Some of these studies produced practical results. They worked, and this made them especially dangerous. At this moment, the Allies faced a dilemma for which they were not prepared. On one hand, these materials were evidence of crimes and could become part of prosecutions. On the other hand, they contained knowledge that could not simply be erased from memory. Their destruction would mean the loss of information that already existed and could be used by others. Additional tension was created by the fact that the world was quickly entering a new phase of confrontation. Former allies were beginning to look at each other with suspicion. The Cold War had not yet been declared, but its outlines were already becoming visible. In these conditions, any knowledge about the human being as an object of influence acquired strategic importance. For this reason, the study of German archives was carried out in a closed regime. The documents were sorted, analyzed, and distributed by levels of access. Part of the materials was used in judicial processes. Another part disappeared into closed storage, not because they were forgotten, but because their meaning went beyond public history. By this moment, it became clear that the subject was not only the past. These archives concerned the future. They touched questions that had no simple answers. Where the boundary of acceptable knowledge is located? Who has the right to possess it? And what happens when these methods end up in the hands of those who are not bound by morality or ideology? In this context, the Nazi archives stopped being only evidence of crimes. They became a problem. They became a source of knowledge that could not be ignored and could not be shown to the world. This understanding determined the further fate of these documents for decades ahead. A Soviet nuclear submarine begins to move into the area where a United States carrier strike group is operating. This part of the ocean is considered one of the most controlled. Here, data from stationary listening systems, routes of anti-submarine aviation, and patrols of escort ships converge. According to all calculations, covert penetration into this area is impossible. The NATO command is sure that any submarine activity will be detected long before a dangerous approach. That is why the carrier group continues to operate calmly and without additional precautions. The system confirms itself and does not give alarm signals. The sea looks clear. The Soviet submarine acts differently than the enemy expects. It does not try to shorten the distance directly and does not attempt to cross search zones by the shortest route. Instead, the crew uses the features of the ocean environment. Deep water layers differ in temperature and density, and these differences distort the propagation of sound. Where acoustic calculations assume reliable detection, a zone of uncertainty appears. The submarine goes below the calculated depths. Its movement becomes slow and extremely cautious. Every maneuver is performed taking into account the acoustic background of the ocean. The submarine does not try to become completely invisible. It becomes uninteresting to a system that is looking for different behavior and different signs of threat. At this time, the carrier strike group continues along the planned route. The escort ships block the directions that are considered the most likely for submarine penetration. Anti-submarine aircraft drop buoys according to the standard scheme and receive expected data. There are no contacts, and this confirms the confidence that the area is safe. Gradually, the Soviet submarine reduces the distance. It enters the space where the enemy is sure of complete control. None of the systems detect its presence because the submarine does not violate the patterns on which the entire logic of the search is built. It is located where, according to calculations, nothing should exist. At this moment, it becomes clear that the operation goes beyond an ordinary exercise. The Soviet submarine not only avoids detection, it finds itself inside a multi-layer defense and remains unnoticed. This means that the very concept of anti-submarine control has limits that were previously considered theoretical. For the crew of the submarine, this is only the beginning. The main task is ahead, not only to penetrate the defense, but to prove that presence can be maintained for a long time without detection. If this succeeds, the consequences will be far more serious than a temporary success in the ocean. The absence of contacts is perceived by the NATO command as confirmation of correct calculations. All data coincide. Stationary listening systems do not record submarine activity. Anti-submarine aircraft return from flights without alarming signals. Escort ships continue to move according to established schemes. In the headquarters, they conclude that the area is fully controlled. At this moment, a decision is made that will later be called a key mistake. The search is not strengthened but optimized. Part of the resources is redistributed to other areas. Aircraft receive new tasks. Buoys are dropped less often and according to a more sparse pattern. This looks like a logical step because the system does not see a threat and does not demand tension. The Soviet submarine continues to move inside the escort. The crew records a change in the enemy activity. By the character of noises and maneuvers, it becomes clear that the density of the search is decreasing. This confirms the main conclusion of the operation. The enemy fully trusts its models and makes decisions based not on reality, but on what the system shows. Now the submarine receives the opportunity to act more freely. It does not accelerate and does not make sharp maneuvers. Its task is not to use the mistake, but to allow it to reveal itself completely. The longer the submarine remains unnoticed, the more obvious the failure of the anti-submarine defense logic becomes. During this period, the crew begins stable tracking of the carrier strike group. The submarine keeps a safe distance and goes on a parallel course. All movement parameters of the target become known. Speed, character of maneuvers, and reaction to changing conditions are recorded without interference. The American side does not notice what is happening. For it, the situation looks stable and predictable. The absence of contacts is perceived as proof that the threat was eliminated at long range. No one allows the thought that a submarine can be inside the escort and conduct observation for a long time. At this moment, the operation stops being only a test of penetration. It becomes an experiment on the control system itself. The Soviet submarine is not hiding from the search. It exists outside the logic of this search, and this is exactly what allows it to remain invisible. Every minute of such tracking increases the effect. This is no longer a coincidence or a fortunate chain of events. This is confirmation that anti-submarine defense can be bypassed not through superiority in force, but through understanding its internal assumptions. The most dangerous stage lies ahead. Any attempt by NATO to regain control may sharply increase the risk. But if even this stage does not lead to detection, the conclusions will be inevitable and extremely unpleasant for those who built the entire system of ocean control. After some time, the first doubts begin to appear in NATO headquarters. They are not formalized as an alarm, and they are not accompanied by system signals. It is more a feeling that the picture is too calm. In the zone where the carrier strike group is operating, nothing unusual happens, but this begins to raise questions among some analysts. A decision is made to conduct an additional inspection of the area, not because a threat has been detected, but because control must be confirmed. Anti-submarine aviation returns to the air. Escort ships receive orders to change routes and to sweep certain sectors more densely. According to the plan of the command, this should either reveal a submarine or finally confirm its absence. The Soviet submarine registers the change in the situation almost immediately. By the character of noises, it becomes clear that the search is resuming. Aircraft return to the area. Buoys appear in the water again. For the crew, this is the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. Now, any mistake may lead to detection and to an instant end of the mission. The commander decides not to leave. Withdrawal would mean the loss of the main proof. The submarine remains at the same depths and keeps minimal speed. Its behavior stays exactly the same as in previous hours. This is a risky step because enemy activity is growing, but stability of behavior allows the submarine not to stand out against the ocean noise. NATO search actions intensify, but remain within the previous logic. Aircraft sweep the sectors that are considered the most probable for the appearance of a submarine. Escort ships shift according to standard schemes. The system looks for a target where it should be according to calculations and not where it is in reality. At some point, the distance between the Soviet submarine and one of the escort ships becomes dangerously small. The noises become clearer. Any maneuver may lead to the crossing of acoustic traces. The crew freezes, waiting for the enemy reaction, but it does not follow. The ship passes by without recording the presence of the submarine. This episode becomes decisive. It shows that even with increased searching effort, the system is unable to go beyond its own assumptions. The attempt to restore control does not lead to detection, but only confirms the blindness of the existing model. The Soviet submarine remains inside the escort and continues to follow the carrier group. Now it becomes clear that the operation is reaching a new level. It is no longer a test of detection limits. It is a demonstration that even active measures do not guarantee the return of control. And if the submarine can stay in such a position further, the consequences for the enemy will be inevitable. The activity of the enemy continues to grow. The search no longer looks routine. Escort ships change their order of movement and begin to close in. Aircraft work longer and return more often. Tension appears in the acoustic picture that cannot be ignored. For the crew of the submarine, it becomes obvious that the enemy is trying to restore the lost sense of control. The NATO command does not know where to look for the submarine, but understands that the former confidence has cracked. Therefore, measures are taken that should block all possible options. Search sectors overlap each other. The movement of ships becomes less predictable. Calculations are carried out in an accelerated mode. This creates the impression that detection is inevitable. The Soviet submarine finds itself in a position where any wrong decision may lead to contact. Maneuvers are reduced to a minimum. Depth is kept within the acoustic shadow. The crew works at the limit of concentration. Any sound, any deviation from the background may be perceived as a sign of a target. At one moment, the situation becomes critical. One of the escort ships passes at a dangerously close distance. Its noises drown the background of the ocean. The hydroacoustic situation changes instantly. Silence falls inside the submarine, in which only the work of mechanisms is heard. Any movement now may be noticed. The escort ship begins a maneuver. Its course changes as if it were trying to clarify a contact. Several minutes stretch endlessly. For the crew, this is the point after which the operation will either end immediately or move into a decisive phase. But the contact is not confirmed. The ship moves away, continuing the search in another sector. This moment becomes a turning point. It shows that even at maximum tension, the enemy is not able to go beyond its own search model. The system works at the limit, but continues to look for the submarine where it should be and not where it is. This creates an illusion of activity without a real result. After this episode, it becomes clear that further tracking is possible. The risk remains high, but the probability of detection decreases with every minute. The enemy exhausts the possibilities of strengthening the search without receiving confirmation of a threat. The Soviet submarine keeps its position and continues to observe the carrier strike group. Now the operation approaches its logical conclusion. It remains to prove the main point, that the submarine not only managed to penetrate and survive, but reached a position where the outcome of a hypothetical battle would have been predetermined. This understanding becomes the moment after which it will be impossible to return to the previous confidence. When the tension gradually subsides, it becomes clear that the most dangerous stage is behind. The enemy has taken all the measures that the existing search logic allowed. and has not received a result. Activity begins to decrease not because of confidence, but because of the absence of new solutions. The system has exhausted itself and no longer knows what to do next. The Soviet submarine continues to follow the carrier strike group. Now, this is not a risky experiment, but a deliberate observation. The crew maintains a stable position relative to the target. The distance makes it possible to maintain continuous control and to preserve conditions for a conditional attack. All parameters confirm the main conclusion. The submarine is located where it should not be and at the same time remains unnoticed. At this moment, a calculation of a hypothetical strike is carried out. Not for the use of weapons, but to record the result of the operation. Taking into account speed, course, and mutual position, it becomes obvious that in a real combat situation, the aircraft carrier would have had no time for a response. The decision would have been made too late. The window for defense would have been closed even before the threat was realized. The important thing is not that an attack is possible. The important thing is that it is possible without preliminary detection. All key elements of the American concept of naval superiority assumed early warning. It was supposed to give time for maneuver and protection, but in this situation, such time does not exist. The Soviet submarine holds its position for as long as the task allows. The tracking continues under conditions where the enemy is confident that the threat is absent. For the crew, it becomes finally clear that the operation has achieved its goal. The proof is obtained not in words and not in reports, but in the real environment of the ocean. After leaving the area and completing the operation, the results are recorded and analyzed. Now they exist not as a hypothesis, but as a fact. The submarine was able to pass unnoticed through NATO defenses, reach an attack position, and remain there for a long time. This means that the system of control over the ocean has a fundamental vulnerability. For the American side, the realization will come later. Not during the exercise and not during the search. It will come after the analysis of the data when it becomes clear that the submarine had been near the carrier group and could have acted without interference. At that moment, a shock will arise that can no longer be ignored. At this stage, it becomes clear that the operation is over. Not because resources have run out or the risk of detection has increased, but because the main conclusion can no longer be cancelled. The American concept of maritime superiority turned out to be blind at the very moment when it was confident in absolute control. The consequences of the decision to hide the German archives did not appear immediately. Outwardly, the post-war world moved toward recovery, openness, and humanism. International organizations were being created, new legal norms were forming, and the principles of human rights protection were publicly declared. But in parallel, there existed another layer of reality in which knowledge about the limits of the human psyche could no longer be ignored. In the scientific environment, changes began that were difficult to link to specific sources, but impossible not to notice in retrospect. Research on stress, isolation, and submission gained new significance. Psychology was increasingly seen not only as a tool of help, but also as a way to predict the behavior of masses. The wording became more cautious, the goals became less public, and the methods became more concealed. Military doctrines also began to change. More and more attention was paid not to the physical destruction of the enemy, but to disorientation. Information pressure, the undermining of trust, the creation of a sense of helplessness and uncertainty gradually became part of strategic thinking. This did not copy the German programs directly, but the logic was similar. Victory began to be perceived as a state of consciousness and not only as a result of battle. This became especially clear in the era of the Cold War. Direct confrontation was becoming too dangerous, and therefore the struggle shifted into the sphere of perception. Fear, confidence, the feeling of control and vulnerability turned into factors of strategic level. In this context, the silence around the German archives acquired a new meaning. They became not a source of ideas, but a reminder of how far one could go. At the same time, the gap between public rhetoric and closed practices grew. Outwardly, it was asserted that such experiments were impossible and unacceptable. Inside, the limits of permissible influence were discussed more and more often, not in the form of experiments on people, but through modeling, analysis, and forecasting. The German archives served as a silent reference point that showed where the dangerous line passed. Over time, this silence began to influence culture as well. Certain topics became taboo. Questions about the manipulation of consciousness, the loss of identity, and controlled behavior were perceived as disturbing and undesirable. They were avoided or simplified. The history of the Third Reich was recorded as an example of absolute evil, but the deep mechanisms that made this evil possible remained outside discussion. The main consequence was not the preservation of specific documents, but the formation of a new caution. The world began to sense that there existed knowledge capable of destroying the foundations of trust between the individual and society. Therefore, the choice was made in favor of fragmented memory. The war was allowed to be remembered, but not fully understood. By this moment, it had become clear that the German archives played a role that went far beyond the history of the Second World War. They influenced which questions could be asked publicly and which had to remain in the shadows. This was not a defeat of science and not a victory of morality. It was a compromise on which a new world was built, full of contradictions and hidden fears. The true meaning of the German archives became clear only years later. They did not explode public consciousness and did not become a sensation. People did not argue about them at international conferences, and films were not made about them immediately after the war. But it was exactly this silence that made their influence long-lasting. These documents did not disappear. They simply stopped being part of open history. The main legacy of this story lies not in the experiments themselves and not in the names of those who conducted them. It lies in the change of attitude toward knowledge. After the war, the world for the first time faced the understanding that not all information makes society stronger. Some knowledge undermines the very foundations of trust between the individual and the system. And that is why the decision was made not to bring it into the light. From that moment, the boundary of what is acceptable in science and in military strategy became less obvious. Formally, humanity rejected the practices of the Third Reich. But informally, it inherited a question that still has no safe answer. How far can one go in understanding the human being without turning that understanding into a tool of suppression? The German archives became a starting point for an era of hidden confrontation. Not as an instruction, but as a warning. They showed that the most dangerous war can be waged not for territories and resources, but for the perception of reality. And that victory in such a war is achieved not by destruction, but by control over how a person thinks, feels, and makes decisions. Today, in a world of technologies, algorithms, and information pressure, this lesson sounds especially alarming. The methods have changed, the forms have become softer, but the logic has remained the same. A war for consciousness does not require camps and laboratories. It only needs an environment in which a person gradually stops distinguishing their own thoughts from imposed ones. The history of the German archives reminds us of a simple and uncomfortable fact. The most dangerous consequences of war do not appear immediately. Sometimes they continue to live in the shadows for decades, shaping decisions, fears, and limitations whose origins no one speaks about anymore. If you are interested in such stories about the hidden side of wars, about knowledge that people preferred to forget, and about decisions that changed the world without loud statements, subscribe to the channel Secret Front. Here we examine what remained outside textbooks and official versions. A subscription will help you not miss new videos and support a project that returns forgotten pages of history. Thank you for watching this episode to the end. These stories deserve to be remembered.